They wore crowns of gold, but their bodies told a different story. Twisted spines, trembling hands, shattered minds buried beneath ermine robes and royal seals. These were kings built for legend and broken by biology. In an age where weakness was treason, they ruled anyway, silently, painfully, defiantly. This is not a tale of glory. It's a procession of limping power, hidden illness, and thrones propped up by denial. Welcome to the side of royalty they never carved into marble. This is British kings with secret disabilities and deformities. And what follows will not sit comfortably. Before we descend any further down this royal rabbit hole, take a second to subscribe. It helps keep this strange little corner of history alive. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Jakarta? Let's see who else is up wandering the halls of history with us. Alfred the Great, England, R 871-899. It's easy to worship the myth of Alfred, scholar king, defender of the realm, the man who learned Latin in middle age just to translate Christian wisdom for his people. The guy who baked some very bad cakes, allegedly, a patron saint of British exceptionalism, if there ever was one. But buried underneath the layers of patriotic fog and monastic hero worship, there's something else. A king not only fighting Vikings, but something far closer, far more personal, and far more relentless. Pain. Real, grinding, humiliating pain. Not the cinematic kind. The kind that leaves you doubled over during a council meeting, praying for the screaming in your guts to stop long enough for you to fake a smile. Alfred's body was a battlefield long before Wessex became one. Chronic illness shadowed him from his youth, one that modern medical historians have tentatively linked to Crohn's disease or some other form of inflammatory bowel disorder. The symptoms line up: recurring abdominal pain, digestive misery, weight fluctuations, and periods of profound physical exhaustion. He described it himself as a sudden and unknown illness that struck him around the time of his marriage and never let go. His biographer, Asser, that Asser recorded it with curious urgency. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a defining feature of the king's life. Alfred had to arrange his day around it. His meals, his sleep, his strategy. Imagine trying to plan the defense of your kingdom while also wondering whether you'd survive your next meal. In today's terms, it might have meant chronic inflammation, gut bleeding, and malnutrition. In Alfred's terms, it meant divine punishment. He saw it as a scourge from God, possibly retribution for some past sin, or maybe just a test of character. It's telling that he doubled down on piety and scholarship in the aftermath. His court became a kind of intellectual monastery, a place where the spirit could rise even as the body failed. While his generals drilled spearmen and fortified burghs, Alfred drilled himself into discipline, one groaning morning at a time. And still, he fought, not just internal collapse, but external annihilation. The Viking raids weren't cinematic either. They were the medieval version of slow-motion horror, systemic, brutal, and clever. Alfred's Wessex was the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom still standing. He was outnumbered, under-resourced, and in constant physical torment. So he did what few kings ever managed to do. He adapted. He abandoned the old aristocratic model of war and reorganized the entire kingdom's military infrastructure. A rotating fyrd system allowed men to alternate between farming and fighting. A network of fortified towns, burghs, spread like a defensive lattice across the land. And through it all, Alfred read, translated, reflected. Most men turn inwards when their bodies betray them. Alfred looked outward. And yet, even the greatest adaptations are still compromises. His illness never left. Contemporary records suggest it flared up during key moments of crisis. Battle plans postponed. Public appearances limited. It's not hard to imagine that some of his famed withdrawals into solitude were less about quiet prayer and more about surviving an invisible storm. There's no record of what his commanders said behind his back, but politics then, as now, punishes visible weakness. To be a sick king was to be a vulnerable king. And Alfred had no shortage of enemies who preferred their monarchs not doubled over in digestive agony. There's something uncomfortably modern in all of this. A public figure masking a private torment, a leader propped up by myth while privately managing a failing body. We like our heroes unbroken. But what if the break is the point? What if the greatness wasn't despite the illness, but because of it? Because Alfred knew what it meant to fight something that didn't obey reason, something that came in waves, something that couldn't be negotiated with or outflanked. He fought the Danes with clever strategy. He fought his body with raw endurance. But both enemies left scars, and only one ever really went away. At his death in 899, his illness was still raging. Wasting, silent, and he knew it. He wasn't escaping anything. He was just holding the line. But Alfred's pain wasn't unique, not really. It was just the first chapter in a long, royal tradition of suffering in silence. Kings in robes hiding bodies in revolt. Some could barely eat. Others could barely walk. One of them, not long after Alfred, could barely eat or walk. And yet, he ruled. A man who couldn't chew. A monarch who only sucked the juices from his food. Edred, the king with a crown and no appetite. Edred, king of the English, R 946-955. History rarely makes room for kings who couldn't feast. Edred, youngest son of Edward the Elder, never commanded the spotlight like his war-hardened relatives. He wasn't the towering martial presence of his half-brother Athelstan, nor the cunning tactician his ancestors might have hoped for. And yet, he wore the crown. In the bleak mid-10th century, a time when to rule was to bleed, and to command was to devour, Edred could barely eat at all. Literally, by multiple accounts, this king of all the English was so afflicted with a mysterious digestive illness that he was incapable of chewing food. He could only suck the juices, one chronicler wrote, with the sort of detached medieval frankness that historians like to quote without fully absorbing the implications. Suck the juices, not chew. Not swallow, just extract what moisture he could, like a monarch in slow, painful decline, living on liquid, ruling by will. And that's how it begins. A king whose digestive system gave out long before the rest of him. Edred's reign, though short, is an eerie study in bodily betrayal. He was crowned in 946, following the murder of his brother, King Edmund I. As if cursed by fate, Edred inherited not only the throne, but a body that barely kept pace with it. He was around 30 years old, still young, still sharp, but already physically breaking down. The historical accounts are maddeningly sparse, but consistent. His illness worsened over time, leaving him increasingly incapacitated. There is a grim irony in that. Edred ruled over the recently unified English kingdoms, a prize fought over for generations. He had power over land, lords, and law, yet no command over his own stomach. At feasts, where kings were expected to gorge in symbolic excess, Edred sat restrained. No meat, no bread, no wine-soaked laughter echoing down the stone halls, just sipping, quietly. A king reduced to a patient, a monarch performing strength while privately rationing every bite of energy. Modern scholars, attempting to decode this ancient affliction, have proposed all manner of retrospective diagnoses: advanced Crohn's disease, degenerative esophageal disorder, late-stage malnutrition secondary to another wasting illness. Nothing confirmed, nothing certain. But one truth remains undisputed. Edred was ill enough that even his political enemies noticed. And yet, he held the kingdom. He didn't just survive, he expanded his influence over Northumbria, which had long been a Viking stronghold and a sore point for English rulers. When the Northumbrians, ever mercurial, decided to back the Norse pretender Eric Bloodaxe instead, Edred didn't retreat. He retaliated, with fire. In 948, he ordered the sacking of Ripon, A brutal show of force designed to destabilize Eric's fragile rule. It worked. The Northumbrians turned on their foreign-backed king within the year. Eric was murdered, stabbed in a bleak ravine, and Edred emerged the unchallenged ruler of the English territories, including the North, all while barely eating. It's almost comical, in that dark, ironic British way. The king who couldn't chew orchestrated one of the most politically decisive moves of the 10th century. His body was breaking, but his kingdom was holding. Some say he ruled through delegation, entrusting much to trusted churchmen like Dunstan, the future archbishop. Others say he ruled through sheer determination, dragging himself through ceremonial duties while propped up by will and ritual. But no matter how he ruled, the strain was visible. By the early 952s, reports described Edred as visibly frail. His voice reportedly weakened, his movements slowed. At court, he grew quieter, not contemplative, just exhausted. There are whispers, likely exaggerated, that he had to be helped to and from council meetings. In an era where masculinity and might were expected of kings, this must have been a cruel spectacle. But if anyone dared challenge him outright, they didn't last long. Edred's authority may have looked fragile, but it was iron at the core. Still, the body always wins in the end. Edred died in 955, after 9 years on the throne. By then, his digestive issues had become life-defining. He had no children, no dramatic final campaign, just a slow, painful ebb. Dunstan was reportedly by his side at the end, a religious figure attending to a monarch whose kingdom outlasted his body. He left behind a country more unified than when he found it, and a question: how much can a king suffer before he becomes something else? A symbol? A cautionary tale? A name in a list no one remembers? But not us. We remember. Because Edred's ghost lingers in every meeting where someone pretends to be fine while their body burns beneath the surface. In every face that smiles politely through illness. And in every leader who sits at the head of the table, quietly enduring something unspeakable, because people need to believe they're unbreakable. But of course, they aren't. None of them were, least of all the next one. A man so powerful he reshaped the fate of a continent, but so swollen in his final years that his own body could barely carry him to the grave. William, the conqueror who couldn't fit in his own armor. 2 kings down, 23 to go, and we're just getting started. If you're still here, you clearly have a taste for the darker corners of history. So hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss what's coming next. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? Is this your midnight mystery binge, or your morning cup of royal dysfunction? William I, the Conqueror. England, R1066-1087. William the Conqueror is a name you probably memorized before you understood what conquest actually meant. The bastard duke from Normandy who crossed the Channel, crushed the Saxons at Hastings, and rewrote English history with a sword in one hand and a cleric in the other. That's the version most of us get. Clean, linear, triumphalist. The victorious foreigner becomes king, builds castles, orders a national survey, and dies in peace. Job done. Except it wasn't. Because William, for all his brutal efficiency and architectural legacy, was also a man whose body gradually turned against him. Not in some sudden tragic twist, not in a blaze of martyrdom or assassination, but slowly, relentlessly. A creeping, physical unraveling that modern medicine might classify as morbid obesity, compounded by chronic injury, compounded again by the consequences of war, age, and unchecked authority. And still, somehow, he ruled. He began life as a child nobody expected to survive. Born around 1028 to Robert, Duke of Normandy, and Herleva, a woman of lower status, William's illegitimacy should have ended his career before it began. Instead, it became the crucible of his ambition. The bastard moniker was never far behind him, but neither was his sword. He learned early that power wasn't inherited, it was taken by force, fear, and an almost pathological refusal to be underestimated. By the time he won the English crown in 1066, William was no stranger to violence or attrition. He was hardened, strategic, and feared. But he was also already showing signs of physical strain. A life of campaigns, long rides, and political stress had taken a toll. Chroniclers described him as broad and heavy-set, strong, certainly, but not agile. And then, as the years went on, that heaviness became more than just an aesthetic. He grew large, and then he grew larger. By the end of his reign, William was described as corpulent, sluggish in movement, and physically limited. It wasn't just the kind of weight gain that comes with age. It was something else. Something that limited his ability to mount a horse, to fight, to move without difficulty. The king, who had once scaled walls and led from the front, now traveled with increasing caution, and only to places where his size could be accommodated. Even his armor had to be specially made. The image of him charging at Hastings becomes almost mythological when placed against the reality of his later years. A man weighed down by not just chainmail, but by his own expanding frame. Still, the court did what all courts do. They played along. You don't question a king's waistline when he can order your family disinherited. You don't comment on a sovereign's breathing when he owns the air you breathe. So the fiction continued of power, of health, of invulnerability. But truth, inconvenient as ever, doesn't need permission. In 1087, William launched a campaign into Normandy's Vexin region to put down rebellion and remind his fractious subjects that their king was still the conqueror. He succeeded militarily. But during the siege of Mantes, a freak accident exposed just how fragile he'd become. His horse reared perhaps from noise, fire, or chaos, and the saddle's metal pommel rammed into William's abdomen with devastating force. That injury is often described in clean, clinical language, an abdominal trauma. But for a man of William's size, already in a state of declining health, it was catastrophic. Infection set in. His internal organs, already under strain, couldn't recover. And what followed wasn't a glorious death. It was drawn out, painful, and oddly undignified for someone who'd once held the known world in his mailed fist. According to several chroniclers, his body swelled after death, grotesquely enough to interfere with the funeral. We'll skip the medieval embellishments. They loved a gory story, but the symbolic point is harder to ignore. Even in death, William's body resisted containment. The man who conquered England couldn't conquer his own decline. And perhaps that's the real legacy here. Not just castles and chronicles, but the image of a ruler who built empires but lost control of the one thing that mattered most, himself. A king too large for his own armor, too heavy for the legend he'd created, too mortal to leave the clean legacy his scribes wanted to tell. But if William's story was about the gradual betrayal of the body, the next one flips the script. Because what if the body never betrayed you at all? What if it simply grew wrong? What if you were born into a shape that made the throne suspicious of you? Ask Richard, not Lionheart, no. Richard III, the twisted king in the twisted tale. Richard III England, R 1483, 1485. Richard III was not supposed to be king, not by birth order, not by political design, and certainly not by reputation. He was the younger brother, the spare. The shadow lurking behind Edward IV's golden hair and battlefield charm. In the pantheon of English monarchs, Richard is the anomaly who became a legend for all the wrong reasons. Or perhaps all the right ones, if you happen to believe that history is written by the victors and cleaned up by the Tudors. But beneath the propaganda and the Shakespearean slander, there's a far more haunting truth about Richard III. One that wasn't fully confirmed until over 5 centuries after his death, when his remains were discovered under a Leicester car park in 2012, curled like a question mark in an oddly narrow grave. His spine wasn't metaphorically crooked, as Thomas More gleefully insisted. It was quite literally curved. Richard III had scoliosis. Not a small deviation, a spinal curvature that modern medical analysis estimated began during adolescence and progressed rapidly enough to reshape his torso. His right shoulder sat higher than his left. His ribcage compressed inward on one side. His spine formed a shaped curve that would have been visible through clothing, especially in an era where fitted armor and ceremonial garments didn't offer the luxury of concealment. And yet, Richard wore the crown. He wore armor, he fought battles, he led charges, he governed, he stood for hours in court, council, and parliament. Despite a body that rebelled against symmetry, he managed to function in a world that prized it, not just function command. Here's where things get complicated. Richard's deformity, for centuries, was treated as both metaphor and diagnosis. Tudor propagandists eager to legitimize Henry VII's shaky claim painted Richard as a physical monster to match their vision of a political one. Shakespeare, writing under Elizabeth I, immortalized him as rudely stamped, deformed, and unfinished. The misshapen spine became symbolic shorthand, twisted back, twisted soul. But as with most propaganda, it was projection disguised as description. Contemporary accounts from Richard's own time don't mention a grotesque hunchback or a gnarled frame. They describe a small man, perhaps slight of build, but not a hobbling caricature. His contemporaries respected his battlefield prowess, his legal reforms, even his piety. The deformity wasn't a public narrative until after his death, when it became politically convenient to suggest that physical irregularity was a sign of moral deviance. Still, his scoliosis was real, and it likely caused real pain. Modern estimates suggest a curvature of 60-70 degrees severe enough to reduce lung capacity, distort posture, and cause chronic discomfort. Daily life for Richard may have involved restricted movement, difficulty sitting or standing for long periods, and an ever-present awareness that his body didn't align with the image a king was supposed to project. But he compensated. He wore tailored armor, possibly custom-forged, to accommodate his curvature. He avoided certain ceremonial postures. He relied on visual command, rich fabrics, deliberate gestures, precise speech. Power, after all, is often about theater, and Richard knew how to stage it. He also governed with a sense of legal precision uncommon for his age. His short reign saw genuine attempts at reform, protection against unjust land seizures, reforms to the bail system, public translation of laws. These aren't the moves of a mad tyrant, they're the moves of someone trying to assert legitimacy in the face of visible doubt. A king whose body made people whisper, a ruler whose very frame demanded explanation. And maybe that's the cruel paradox of Richard's story. His physical difference was weaponized only after his death, when his enemies no longer had to fear his actual governance. In life, his condition was something to be managed, hidden, perhaps even ignored. In death, it became his defining feature. That's the danger of being visibly different in power. Your image is no longer your own. And then there's the ending. Bosworth Field, 1485. Richard dies in battle, fighting, charging, refusing to retreat. It's a messy, ignoble death, according to legend. But for a king whose body was treated as an insult, there's something almost defiant in the way he died. Upright, armed, on horseback, the last English king to die in combat. He was dragged through history by people who never saw his spine, only what it symbolized. But now, we've seen the bones, and the curve, and the humanity. Yet Richard's story isn't just about visibility. It's about judgment, about how power is policed through aesthetics. Which brings us to his distant predecessor, a man whose condition wasn't visible from the outside, but whose skin became the subject of medieval scrutiny. A monarch whose face told a story no one could look away from. Henry, not the eighth, not yet. Henry IV, the king whose skin peeled away from his crown. Henry IV, England, R. 1399-1413. Henry IV was not born to be king, but he took the throne anyway. Son of John of Gaunt, cousin of Richard II, and founder of the Lancastrian dynasty, Henry Bolingbroke was a man who understood both the etiquette of courtly charm and the sharp calculus of political necessity. He was athletic, handsome, and well-educated, a nobleman in the full sense of the word, until, one day, he wasn't just noble, he was royal, sort of. His path to the throne involved that most English of rituals, deposition. When Richard II proved too unstable, too arrogant, or simply too unlucky to hold the crown, Henry stepped in with a claim dressed up as justice. He wasn't the first to remove a sitting monarch, but he was the first to succeed and survive long enough to regret it. Because once he became king, something else took the throne too. An illness, not one that struck like lightning, but one that crept in like fog, relentless, inexplicable, and increasingly hard to hide. It began subtly enough, reports of fatigue, withdrawals from court, delays in travel, but over time, the symptoms became harder to ignore. By the late 1400 seconds, observers noted eruptions on his skin. A leprous condition, some called it, though that term in medieval medicine often served as a catch-all for any visible and disfiguring skin disease. Others described swelling, blistering, and painful lesions on his face and neck. The king began to hide his face behind cloths or withdraw from ceremonial duties altogether. Modern medical historians have speculated on everything from eczema to psoriasis to severe rosacea to even syphilis, though that last theory doesn't hold up to rigorous scrutiny, especially given the time period. There is no definitive diagnosis. But what is clear is this: whatever afflicted Henry IV, it wasn't just cosmetic. It was painful. It was unpredictable. And it made kingship already a performance into a kind of daily crisis management. What happens to a monarch when his face becomes a site of suspicion? In the medieval world, visible disfigurement wasn't just medical, it was theological. The body reflected the soul, or so the logic went. A king's illness wasn't merely a health issue, it was a divine comment, a warning, a punishment. Some even whispered that Henry's skin condition was retribution for the deposition of Richard II. He had taken the crown by force, maybe God was taking it back, piece by piece. The irony is that Henry, for all his visible deterioration, remained sharp of mind. He continued to govern, continued to lead, but he did so increasingly from behind a veil of seclusion. He missed parliament sessions, he delegated military campaigns. When he did appear in public, it was often brief, ceremonial, and at a distance. The image of kingship was everything, and Henry's image was cracking, quite literally. But he didn't relinquish power, he didn't abdicate, he didn't wallow in self-pity or vanish from history. Instead, he did something quieter, more unnerving. He endured. For 14 years, through rebellion, illness, and political strain, he remained king, the first of his line, the foundation of Lancastrian rule. It's tempting to reduce Henry IV to a medical case study or a cautionary tale, but he's something else, something stranger. He's a reminder that monarchy is, above all else, a performance of normalcy. And when that normalcy begins to physically dissolve, the fiction becomes harder to maintain. The court still bowed, the nobles still swore loyalty, the coin still bore his name. But everyone knew something was wrong. They just didn't have the words or the right to say them aloud. Near the end of his reign, Henry experienced bouts of what sources call fits or swoonings, sudden episodes of collapse or unconsciousness. He suffered one while praying in Westminster Abbey, reportedly near the shrine of Edward the Confessor. There were whispers that he would die right there on holy ground. Instead, he awoke, muttered a few defiant words, and demanded to be taken elsewhere. A king doesn't die in public, especially not a king who spent his life trying to hold his body together while the crown slowly eats away at him. He died in 1413, aged 45. His reign had been filled with uprisings, illness, and suspicion, but also stability. He had done what many others couldn't, held the throne after taking it by force. And his son, young, ambitious, and strikingly different, would go on to become Henry V, the darling of Agincourt and of Shakespeare's stage. But the story of Henry IV leaves us with a quiet unease, because it asks a simple question: what does a king owe his people, his strength, or the illusion of it? And what happens when even the illusion becomes too painful to maintain? That's where we turn next. To a king who lost not his face, but his mind. Not in rage, not in madness, in silence. A monarch who fell inward until the entire court began to whisper the one word you're never supposed to say near the throne. Broken. Edward VI, England, R. 1547, 1553. It's easy to forget Edward VI even existed. Wedged awkwardly between the gory theater of Henry VIII and the iron-willed spectacle of Elizabeth I, Edward tends to be treated more like a transitional paragraph than a king. A polite footnote. The boy before the storm. And in some ways, he was all of that. A king who never reached adulthood, a reformer who never lived to defend his reforms. A child whose crown was far too heavy and whose lungs were far too weak. But if history loves to forget Edward, it's probably because his story isn't convenient. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. He didn't command armies. He didn't inspire bards. He simply faded, slowly, visibly, publicly. And the realm, for all its grandeur, quietly arranged itself around his decline, pretending nothing was wrong, even as everyone knew exactly how it would end. Edward was born in 1537, the long-prayed-for son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. His mother died days after childbirth, and the country mourned, or perhaps sighed in relief. At last, a male heir. A future that looked, for a moment, unshakably stable. But the irony was already in motion. Edward would be the first monarch of England raised Protestant from the cradle. His tutors were hand-picked for their reformist zeal, humanist scholars, evangelical theologians, men who believed the boy king would be the embodiment of the new order. They drilled into him not only scripture and Latin, but policy and purpose. Even as a child, he was treated like an instrument of God's will, a clean slate upon which a reformation could be written. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward was 9. He became king in a glittering ceremony that no one believed he truly controlled. Real power fell to his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who took the title of Lord Protector. Later, it passed to John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. The crown moved from one adult hand to another, while the boy who wore it grew thinner and quieter. There are portraits of Edward from these years, painted in the stiff, formal Tudor style. He's poised, delicate, almost too composed for a child. But behind the painted flesh tones and jeweled collars is a growing problem. He was sick, often. At first, it was dismissed. Growing pains, fevers, coughs, the usual ailments of youth. But by early 1553, it was no longer avoidable. Edward was wasting. He began to lose weight rapidly. His cough worsened. He developed a hoarseness, then breathlessness, then a pale, almost waxy complexion. Ambassadors began sending coded reports back to Europe, noting how the king was observed to spit blood. The court, of course, denied everything. But medicine, even then, didn't care for court protocol. Modern scholars widely believe Edward died of tuberculosis, then known as consumption, a slow systemic illness that drains the body while leaving the mind clear enough to know exactly what's happening. And that's the part often overlooked. Edward knew. He wasn't just fading physically, he was racing politically. As his health declined, his urgency increased. He pushed harder for Protestant reform. He revised the Book of Common Prayer. He supported more radical preachers. His education, rooted in evangelical logic, had taught him that salvation lay not just in faith, but in structure. The church must be purified. The realm must be preserved. And the line of succession must be corrected. Because Edward had a problem. Two, in fact. Their names were Mary and Elizabeth. Mary, his older half-sister, was Catholic, loyal to the Old Mass, the Latin liturgy, the papal order. Elizabeth, more ambiguous, formally Protestant, but politically quiet. Edward, in his declining months, couldn't risk either, so he rewrote the will. He named Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, as heir, a teenage girl, devoutly Protestant, and conveniently married into the Dudley family, the same family that currently controlled the Regency Council. It was a last political act from a dying king, not one of rebellion, but of preservation. And then, just like that, he was gone. He died in July 1553, just 15 years old. The official announcements were delayed. The court scrambled to install Jane as queen. The cover-up failed. Mary rallied supporters, marched on London, and took the throne within days. Lady Jane Grey was executed the following year, and Edward became what he'd feared most, a brief candle, a Protestant hope extinguished before it could catch fire. But even in death, Edward's reign lingers not because of what he did, but because of what he couldn't. He couldn't survive. He couldn't choose his legacy. He couldn't escape the crown that had been placed on his head before he understood what it cost. And he wasn't the last Tudor to live in the shadow of fragile health. Because after the boy king came the kingmaker, the man who seized the throne on the battlefield, who clawed power from the wreckage of war, and who, for all his political cunning, would spend his final years locked in a body slowly grinding itself down. Henry Tudor, Henry VII, the king who won the throne and spent the rest of his life paying for it. Edward VI, England, R. 1547-1553. It's easy to forget Edward VI even existed. Wedged awkwardly between the gory theater of Henry VIII and the iron-willed spectacle of Elizabeth I, Edward tends to be treated more like a transitional paragraph than a king, a polite footnote, the boy before the storm. And in some ways, he was all of that. A king who never reached adulthood, a reformer who never lived to defend his reforms. A child whose crown was far too heavy and whose lungs were far too weak. But if history loves to forget Edward, it's probably because his story isn't convenient. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. He didn't command armies. He didn't inspire bards. He simply faded, slowly, visibly, publicly. And the realm, for all its grandeur, quietly arranged itself around his decline, pretending nothing was wrong, even as everyone knew exactly how it would end. Edward was born in 1537, the long-prayed-for son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. His mother died days after childbirth, and the country mourned, or perhaps sighed in relief. At last, a male heir, a future that looked, for a moment, unshakably stable. But the irony was already in motion. Edward would be the first monarch of England raised Protestant from the cradle. His tutors were hand-picked for their reformist zeal, humanist scholars, evangelical theologians, men who believed the boy king would be the embodiment of the new order. They drilled into him not only scripture and Latin, but policy and purpose. Even as a child, he was treated like an instrument of God's will, a clean slate upon which a reformation could be written. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward was 9. He became king in a glittering ceremony that no one believed he truly controlled. Real power fell to his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who took the title of Lord Protector. Later, it passed to John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. The crown moved from one adult hand to another, while the boy who wore it grew thinner and quieter. There are portraits of Edward from these years, painted in the stiff, formal Tudor style. He's poised, delicate, almost too composed for a child. But behind the painted flesh tones and jeweled collars is a growing problem. He was sick, often. At first, it was dismissed. Growing pains, fevers, coughs, the usual ailments of youth, but by early 1553, it was no longer avoidable. Edward was wasting. He began to lose weight rapidly. His cough worsened. He developed a hoarseness, then breathlessness, then a pale, almost waxy complexion. Ambassadors began sending coded reports back to Europe, noting how the king was observed to spit blood. The court, of course, denied everything. But medicine, even then, didn't care for court protocol. Modern scholars widely believe Edward died of tuberculosis, then known as consumption, a slow systemic illness that drains the body while leaving the mind clear enough to know exactly what's happening. And that's the part often overlooked. Edward knew. He wasn't just fading physically, he was racing politically. As his health declined, his urgency increased. He pushed harder for Protestant reform. He revised the Book of Common Prayer. He supported more radical preachers. His education, rooted in evangelical logic, had taught him that salvation lay not just in faith, but in structure. The church must be purified. The realm must be preserved. And the line of succession must be corrected. Because Edward had a problem. Two, in fact. Their names were Mary and Elizabeth. Mary, his older half-sister, was Catholic, loyal to the Old Mass, the Latin liturgy, the papal order. Elizabeth, more ambiguous, formally Protestant, but politically quiet. Edward, in his declining months, couldn't risk either, so he rewrote the will. He named Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, as heir, a teenage girl, devoutly Protestant, and conveniently married into the Dudley family, the same family that currently controlled the Regency Council. It was a last political act from a dying king, not one of rebellion, but of preservation. And then, just like that, he was gone. He died in July 1553, just 15 years old. The official announcements were delayed. The court scrambled to install Jane as queen. The cover-up failed. Mary rallied supporters, marched on London, and took the throne within days. Lady Jane Grey was executed the following year, and Edward became what he'd feared most, a brief candle, a Protestant hope extinguished before it could catch fire. But even in death, Edward's reign lingers not because of what he did, but because of what he couldn't. He couldn't survive. He couldn't choose his legacy. He couldn't escape the crown that had been placed on his head before he understood what it cost. And he wasn't the last Tudor to live in the shadow of fragile health. Because after the boy king came the kingmaker, the man who seized the throne on the battlefield, who clawed power from the wreckage of war, and who, for all his political cunning, would spend his final years locked in a body slowly grinding itself down. Henry Tudor, Henry VII, the king who won the throne and spent the rest of his life paying for it. Henry VII, England, R. 1485-1509. Every dynasty begins with a gamble. Henry VII was the kind you only attempt if you're desperate or divinely convinced. He had no overwhelming army, no overflowing treasury, no clear-cut right to the throne. What he did have was a bloodline so convoluted it made a legal scholar squint, and just enough enemies who hated Richard III more than they distrusted him. The rest he manufactured: alliances, mythologies, marriages, and crucially silence. Henry VII didn't roar his way into kingship, he crept. But the thing about men who win by calculation instead of charisma is this: they tend to keep calculating, long after the battle's over, long after the crown is secure. Because what got you the throne won't let you rest on it. And so Henry ruled like a man, always expecting betrayal, tight-lipped, cold-eyed, and increasingly exhausted by the business of surviving. By the time he died in 1509, he had successfully founded the Tudor dynasty, tamed the overmighty nobility, established the first modernish bureaucracy, and left behind a treasury full enough to make his famously spendy son look like a sugar-drunk heir. That's the legacy. But underneath it all, Henry's body was failing him, slowly, repetitively. And painfully. Henry's health didn't decline in one dramatic event. It eroded, a dull drumbeat of illness that picked up speed as his political paranoia deepened. Reports from his later years mention recurring fevers, chest complaints, restricted movement, and bouts of what we now suspect may have been tuberculosis, or at least some form of chronic respiratory disease. One contemporary described him as growing consumptive, an old term for a wasting illness that leaves the sufferer increasingly weak and gaunt. And then there was the gout. Gout is a condition often played for laughs in history books, the king's disease, associated with rich diets, wine, and opulent excess. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, it wasn't a joke. It was debilitating. It turned simple acts, walking, dressing, sitting into exercises in pain management. Swollen joints, particularly in the feet and hands, made public appearances awkward and long council meetings unbearable. Henry had once been known for endurance. He traveled frequently, held long meetings, and oversaw financial accounts personally. But in his later years, his mobility became limited, audiences shortened, travel became rare. And the worse his body became, the tighter his grip on power. There's something almost poetic in the way Henry's illness mirrored his rule. Controlled, quiet, difficult to read, he rarely spoke of his health publicly. He allowed no vulnerability to leak into the official narrative, but the absences grew longer, the portraits grew more conservative, the king always reserved became increasingly withdrawn, even within his own family. After the death of his wife, Elizabeth of York, in 1503, something shifted. They had been, by most accounts, a rare thing for royal marriages, compatible. There's no flowery love story here, but there was mutual respect, and something closer to genuine affection than most arranged marriages achieved. Her death, followed by the loss of their eldest son Arthur 2 years earlier, left Henry bereaved and alone. And he stayed alone. He considered remarriage. Negotiations were opened with Margaret of Savoy and even with Queen Joanna of Naples, but nothing came of it. Whether for political reasons or sheer personal fatigue, Henry VII remained a widower. It was as if the machinery of his life, built so carefully, operated so ruthlessly, had finally outpaced its architect. The final years of his reign were marked by tighter financial control, higher taxes, and increasing public resentment. He retreated into the machinery of governance, micromanaging fiscal matters and obsessing over receipts. He was one of the few English kings who actually seemed to enjoy reading the budget, or at least needed it to stay sane, but it didn't sustain him forever. By early 1509, his health collapsed. He became bedridden. The records are vague: consumption, decline, failing breath. But the symptoms suggest he struggled to breathe and suffered significant physical deterioration. His will was finalized. His son, the 17-year-old Henry VIII, was prepared to take power. And then, quietly, Henry VII died. No grand speeches, no battlefield blaze, just the end of a long, carefully orchestrated life. But if his body gave way slowly, his dynasty exploded with energy the moment he was gone. His son would undo in 5 years what took Henry 20 to build. Alliances unraveled. Wars reignited. The treasury was emptied on tournaments, palaces, and political vanity. Henry VII was barely cold before his legacy was turned into a cautionary tale of too much caution. Still, his illness matters. Not because it defined him, but because he refused to let it. Henry VII ruled through calculation, not charisma, through paperwork, not performance, through silence, not spectacle, and that's why his body's quiet unraveling is so fitting. It didn't scream, it didn't demand attention, it just withdrew, step by step, until the king and the man had both slipped beneath the surface. And then came his son, louder, larger, hungrier, with legs that would rot and appetites that would outlive everyone. Henry VIII, king of 6 wives, many enemies, and at least one body part that never healed. Henry VIII, England, R 1509-1547. No English king casts a longer shadow than Henry VIII. Not just because of the break with Rome, or the wives, or the heads. Not even because of the palaces, the portraits, or the choir of historians still trying to decide whether he was a visionary or a walking cautionary tale in ermine. No, Henry casts a long shadow because he made his body into a symbol and then spent the last third of his life slowly losing control of it. When he came to the throne in 1509, Henry was everything a Renaissance prince was supposed to be. Tall, athletic, golden-haired, broad-shouldered, and obsessively physical. He hunted. He jousted. He danced. He wrestled courtiers to the floor at Christmas feasts just to show he could. He was the living embodiment of royal virility, married young, poised to sire a dynasty, the very image of a king who ruled through sheer bodily presence. And then, over time, that body turned on him. Let's start with the injury. In 1536, Henry suffered a major fall during a jousting match at Greenwich. He was thrown from his horse. Some say he was briefly unconscious, and his legs were badly damaged. From that point onward, he never quite recovered. The wound on his leg reopened again and again in the years that followed. Infection set in, not once but repeatedly. And though the records are cloaked in polite court language, sore, afflicted, fevered, the meaning was clear. The king was increasingly immobile. He could still ride. He could still appear at court. But his agility was gone. His stamina faded. His dependence on attendants and devices to move around grew year by year. And with physical decline came an increase in weight, gradual at first, then alarmingly rapid. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer the Golden Prince. He was over 300 pounds, struggling to climb stairs, and reliant on constructed devices, mechanical chairs, and reinforced platforms to navigate his own palaces. His armor had to be resized, his horses specially chosen, his beds widened, and all the while, his physicians scrambled to manage the pain without admitting the truth. The King of England was not well. But perhaps most fascinating and disturbing is how all of this was handled politically. Because no one told Henry no. He was still the king, still supreme head of the Church of England, still the man who had forced an empire to pivot around his personal desires. So courtiers flattered. Artists lied. State portraits continued to present him as broad-chested and commanding, with no hint of the physical pain beneath the robes. When Hans Holbein painted him in 1537, the result was a masterpiece of curated power. Square stance, direct gaze, no visible weakness. But by then, the real Henry was already living in a body that ached every hour of every day. There's a kind of cruel irony in it all. Henry spent his reign obsessed with control of the church, of succession, of lineage, of law, and yet he couldn't control the very thing that mattered most to his self-image, his physical dominance. He had torn apart England's religious fabric for the right to produce a healthy male heir, but he himself was increasingly dependent on his servants just to walk from one side of the room to the other. He compensated, of course, with ceremony, with legislation, with executions. The weaker his body became, the stronger his decrees grew. He lashed out politically when he could no longer lash out physically. Enemies were declared traitors for hesitating. Friends were turned into corpses for disagreeing. Ministers rose and fell with terrifying speed. Even his marriages, once driven by lust or lineage, took on a strange theatrical tone, each wife a chapter, in a drama that increasingly had nothing to do with love or politics, and everything to do with legacy. But beneath all that drama was a man whose physical suffering shaped every decision he made. The king who once danced until dawn now rarely left his chamber. The man who once rode for hours through the forest now sat, watching others hunt on his behalf. The monarch who built an empire of presence became increasingly absent from his own rule. And yet, the illusion endured, the myth held, because even in decline, Henry VIII remained terrifyingly powerful. not because of what he could still do, but because no one was sure what he might order done. His physical weakness did not soften his reign, it sharpened it. He became more volatile, not less, more suspicious, more paranoid, more determined to force the country to remember the man he had once been, even if they could see clearly that he was no longer that man. When he died in 1547, the air of relief at court was almost palpable, not because the king was unloved, but because the reign had become unsustainable. England had been held together not by governance, but by fear, and now the weight was lifted, literally. But illness and pain don't just vanish when the crown changes heads. The next king was born limping, not physically, but constitutionally. James Stuart, scholar, scribbler, king of 2 crowns, and a man whose legs couldn't quite catch up with his titles. James VI and I, Scotland 1567-1625, England divided by Ireland 1603-1625. James Stuart was a man who had too many crowns and not nearly enough cartilage. King of Scotland at 13 months old, King of England and Ireland by the age of 36. First ruler to unite the crowns of the British Isles, not by conquest, but by inheritance and an inconvenient death in the Tudor bloodline. By the time he arrived in London in 1603, James was a walking constitutional riddle, Scottish in accent, English in ambition, European in upbringing, and often too unwell to convincingly rule in any of the styles expected of him. But perhaps the strangest thing about James is this: for a man with so much power, he had the physicality of someone who looked like they'd borrowed the wrong body for the job. From childhood, James was marked if not by visible deformity, then by what early sources called weakness of the limbs. Contemporaries described him as knock-kneed, unsteady on his feet, and prone to exaggerated gestures that hinted more at instability than flamboyance. He waddled, some said. Others, more polite, noted that he had difficulty mounting horses without assistance. At court, he walked with a curious gait that courtiers politely didn't name but privately mimicked. He was not elegant, he was not athletic, and he knew it. Modern biographers and medical historians have speculated that James may have suffered from rickets in early childhood, a condition caused by vitamin D deficiency, which softens bones and leads to skeletal deformities, particularly in the legs. In the 16th century, before sunlight and nutrition became the cornerstones of childhood health, this wasn't rare, but it was defining. If you were royal, your limp mattered. And yet James was never allowed to sit still. His childhood was anything but peaceful. Crowned King of Scots before he could speak, orphaned politically by the forced abdication of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, and raised under a revolving door of Tudors, regents, and factional backers, James didn't so much inherit a throne as he survived his way into one. By the time he reached his teens, he was a survivor of more attempted kidnappings and regency overthrows than most people manage in a lifetime. And through it all, his body never quite kept pace. He was reportedly asthmatic, with recurring respiratory issues. His hands trembled under stress. He suffered from kidney stones later in life, which brought bouts of agony that even court doctors couldn't fully mask. There were reports of spasms and fits, likely mischaracterized, but hinting at deeper neurological or muscular issues. Some described him as having a twitch or a constant fidget. But James did something few kings with disabilities ever managed. He turned it into strategy. He made his intellect the centerpiece. He leaned into rhetoric. If he couldn't ride like a warrior, he would outtalk them all. And he did. James was a prolific writer. Treatises on kingship, essays on witchcraft, theological arguments, poetic digressions. He was both deeply religious and flamboyantly ironic. His writings on royal authority, the true law of free monarchies, remain one of the most rigorous defenses of divine right monarchy in European history. His obsession with order, hierarchical, patriarchal, God-given, can be read as both a political philosophy and a personal coping mechanism. Because James understood disorder. He lived it, wore it, walked it. He also understood how appearance shaped perception, and so he wore heavy layers to disguise his gait. He surrounded himself with taller courtiers. He posed carefully in portraits, often sitting, to obscure the awkwardness of movement. His public appearances were brief, curated, and choreographed. When he spoke, it was with deliberate brilliance layered with wit, theological gravity, and the occasional scandalous joke. If his legs didn't command respect, his tongue certainly did. But despite his command of language, James couldn't quite command the English court. Elizabeth I had been magnetic, terrifying, physically theatrical. James, by contrast, arrived in London like a brilliant but uncharismatic cousin at a royal family reunion. He was mocked for his limp, for his openly affectionate relationships with male courtiers, for his accent, and for the fact that his ceremonial robes always seemed a size too large. When he waddled into Parliament, jokes rippled behind his back about the king, whose legs prayed before he did. And yet, for all the mockery, James was effective. He kept peace with Spain. He avoided major wars. He commissioned the King James Bible a literary and religious landmark. He presided over the beginnings of British colonialism, and he kept his throne for over 2 decades. But his later years were marked by increasing pain. His kidneys flared, his joints stiffened, he moved less and dictated more. At court banquets, he appeared briefly, said little, and retreated. Reports describe him as swollen, breathless, carried in litters between palaces. He died in 1625, aged 58. Not in disgrace, not in chaos, just exhausted, by rule, by legacy, by a life lived in a body that never made it easy. But James's story is not about defeat. It's about persistence, about what it means to rule from a chair when everyone expects you to ride, to argue when others want you to charge, to limp through a court that only respects a march. And if James made kingship look a little eccentric, his son would try to make it look majestic again. Charles, poised, fragile, and already bent by something else entirely. Not the legs, but the bones. And not just his own. Charles I, England divided by Scotland, divided by Ireland, are 1625-1649. Charles I was born into a body that didn't fit the mold. Not in the symbolic sense, though. That would come later, but quite literally. As a child, he couldn't walk without help. His legs were too weak, his muscles underdeveloped, his movements awkward. While his older siblings ran and rode and rehearsed their royal futures, Charles lagged behind, not out of laziness or fear, but because something in his bones simply hadn't come together quite right. The diagnosis doesn't survive the centuries, but the symptoms do. He was born the second son of James VI, and Anne of Denmark, and for the first few years of his life, it wasn't clear whether Charles would survive, let alone rule. Some have speculated that he, like his father, suffered from rickets, a common affliction in early modern Europe, particularly among children born into dark, drafty palaces and wrapped in swaddling cloths that kept them warm but blocked sunlight. Rickets softened bones, weakened limbs, and left lifelong traces, bowed legs, fragile joints, and postural instability. Whatever the exact cause, Charles was visibly different from his peers. He was small for his age, slow to develop, and unable to walk unaided until he was nearly 4. In a court obsessed with appearances where princes were judged on posture, poise, and the ease with which they could vault onto a horse, this was a dangerous deficit. Kingship wasn't just inherited. It was performed. And Charles's early body couldn't perform much of anything. He was sent to the countryside for a time, under the care of trusted attendants, to strengthen his limbs and build resilience. It worked, sort of. With years of therapeutic exercise, enforced riding lessons, and no small amount of royal determination, Charles learned to compensate. He grew stronger, he learned to ride, he learned to fence. He could walk unassisted, even lead a formal procession. But the early stigma never entirely left him. He carried it in his bearing, tight-shouldered, rigid, always a little too formal, like a man playing a role carved out for someone taller, louder, more naturally imposing. And then there was the stammer. A persistent speech impediment, present from childhood and never fully resolved. It wasn't dramatic, nothing like his great-grandson George VI's, but it was there, enough to make public speaking a strain, enough to turn parliamentary debate into a minefield, enough to make him speak less and withdraw more, until silence became his default political posture. Charles wasn't shy. He was cautious, measured, and deeply fatally convinced that kingship was not a matter of charm or popularity, but of divine right. His frailties had taught him to armor himself with formality, and so, where his father had ruled with words and laughter and books, Charles ruled with velvet gloves and locked doors. He dressed immaculately, held court with icy dignity, rarely explained himself. It worked for a while. He inherited the throne in 1625, upon James's death, and quickly married Henrietta Maria of France, a devout Catholic queen consort who introduced even more tension into an already anxious Protestant kingdom. His reign was immediately complicated. Parliament was suspicious of his religious leanings, his spending, and his refusal to compromise. But Charles didn't bend. He believed in monarchy the way a man believes in a cathedral, not as a structure you can renovate, but as something sacred. When tensions with Parliament reached a breaking point, Charles didn't diffuse the situation, he dissolved Parliament altogether. For 11 years, he ruled without them, the so-called personal rule. To some, it was tyranny. To Charles, it was housekeeping. But behind the divine authority and ceremonial composure, the old frailties still whispered. In private, Charles remained physically delicate. He suffered chronic fatigue and respiratory complaints. His joints ached. He tired easily. His stammer returned under stress. He rarely showed emotion, not because he lacked it, but because he didn't trust his body to express it with dignity. And then came war. The English Civil War broke out in 1642, and Charles, this quiet, rigid man with a body never built for battle, became the unlikely general of a royalist resistance. He led campaigns, summoned councils, made alliances, broke them, but he was always one step behind, not just strategically, but culturally. His view of kingship was 50 years out of date. His belief in divine authority had no audience in a country suddenly demanding something more modern, more accountable. He was captured, tried, executed in 1649. The image is iconic. Charles in black, calm, composed, stepping out onto the scaffold with unshakable dignity. But what's often forgotten is how still he was, how silent. The quiet boy who couldn't walk, now a grown man walking his final steps with the same iron will that once dragged his small body upright. Charles's physical frailty never defined him, but it shaped the king he became, reserved, principled, immovable to the point of ruin, and the dynasty did not die with him. Because when kings fall, their brothers sometimes rise. And the next one, his brother, would spend his reign lurching between revelry and seizures, between grandeur and collapse, between life and something just outside of it. Charles was calm. Charles was still. But Charles II would not sit still for long. Charles II, England divided by Scotland, divided by Ireland, R 1660-1685. If Charles I was the king who died with dignity, then Charles II was the king who lived in defiance of it. Born into civil war, raised in exile, crowned only after a decade of Republican rule had exhausted the country's appetite for Puritan discipline, Charles II entered kingship like a man stepping into a costume that had been gathering dust in a locked wardrobe. And he wore it with a wink. He laughed more than his father, spoke better than his grandfather, and moved through the court like a man who knew full well how close he'd come to living his entire life on the wrong side of history. The Merry Monarch, they called him. A charming cynic, a patron of science, a connoisseur of mistresses, masks, and maritime disasters. But beneath the curls, the elegance, and the theatrical irreverence, Charles carried something else, something far less festive. A mystery of the body, a strange, recurring illness, a creeping failure that modern biographers still argue over because the records leave us with more symptoms than certainty. What we know is this: by the latter part of his reign, Charles II suffered intermittent episodes of collapse, fatigue, convulsions, and organ dysfunction. And it would all end suddenly, violently, in a death that looked less like natural aging and more like a body that had finally run out of tricks. But we'll get there. First, the slow unraveling. Throughout the 1,670 seconds and early 1,680 seconds, Charles's health showed signs of strain. He experienced swelling in his limbs, lethargy, muscle cramps. He sometimes withdrew from court without explanation. There are notes in ambassadorial dispatches describing the king as indisposed or afflicted by gout, which may have been both true and insufficient. Some historians have proposed chronic kidney disease. Others suspect a neurovascular condition. The most alarming symptoms came in waves: tremors, speech slurring, even brief periods of mental fog. They were not frequent enough to raise panic, but just frequent enough to be noticed. He refused, of course, to show weakness. Kings rarely admit anything, and Charles especially knew how quickly rumor could rot a throne. His own father had been brought low not by illness, but by an inability to control perception. Charles II had learned from that. He kept his circle tight. Doctors were sworn to secrecy. But in February 1685, the fiction collapsed. During a routine morning in Whitehall, Charles was suddenly struck by a violent seizure while dressing. He collapsed, unconscious, with his attendants scrambling in confusion. Physicians were summoned, dozens of them, each arriving with tinctures, leeches, and contradictions. What followed was an agonizing week of treatment, misunderstanding, and a slow descent into multi-organ failure. They bled him, they blistered him, they dosed him with herbs, mercury, and enough contradictory medieval interventions to fill a pharmacy and a horror novel. None of it worked. His body was shutting down. He developed a high fever. He couldn't swallow. He drifted in and out of lucidity, issuing orders, blessing his illegitimate children, asking for forgiveness, and famously apologizing to his courtiers for being such an unconscionable time a-dying. It was very Charles. The official cause of death, as declared at the time, was apoplexy, an old term for stroke. But later analyses of the autopsy notes and symptoms point more convincingly to uremia caused by kidney failure. Or perhaps a series of seizures brought on by severe electrolyte imbalance. Or both. The real point isn't what killed him, but how long it had been trying to. Because Charles II's reign, beneath its surface sparkle, had always contained shadows. The Restoration brought back kingship, yes, but it also brought back plague, and fire, and religious division. And constant whispers about legitimacy and mortality. Charles held it all together through charisma and calculation. But the body doesn't care about diplomacy. It decays anyway. And for all his cultivated ease, Charles was never entirely well. He masked it, he danced through it, but he couldn't outwit it. In the end, the mask slipped. And what remained was a man who had ruled for 25 years, fathered at least 12 illegitimate children, avoided assassination, outlived scandal, and died from something no one saw coming until it was already too late. His brother, James, succeeded him, but not in charm, or wit, or subtlety, and certainly not in health. William III, England divided by Scotland, divided by Ireland, R 1689–1702. William III did not come to England to be loved. He came to secure a Protestant succession, stabilize the Dutch-English alliance against France, and, if possible, survive the trip. Affection was optional, breathing was not. From the beginning, William of Orange was defined by contradiction, a foreign king with domestic legitimacy, a Calvinist ruler in a land still haunted by Catholic ghosts, a wartime leader who could barely breathe in peacetime. His very body was a paradox, frail, asthmatic, and perpetually teetering between functionality and collapse. He was not supposed to look like a king, tall but gaunt, stiff in movement. His face seemed built for suspicion, hollow-cheeked, pallid, with deep-set eyes that always seemed to narrow first, then blink later. But William had never been interested in theater. He was a man of military instinct and Protestant conviction, not courtly charisma. His power came not from presence, but persistence. And he needed all of it, because his lungs, from youth onward, were barely on his side. Asthma, as we now call it, shaped William's entire life. Chronic, severe, and poorly managed by the medicine of the 17th century, it left him constantly wheezing, short of breath, and physically limited. Episodes could be triggered by dampness, cold, stress, or seemingly nothing at all. In an age without inhalers or steroids, there was little to do but endure and avoid any environment that might worsen the condition. Which is why, upon arriving in London after the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, William found Whitehall Palace intolerable, too damp, too smoky, too London. He immediately began shifting the center of royal life to Kensington and Hampton Court residences situated farther west, with cleaner air, better drainage, and marginally more breathing room. The move wasn't just a preference, it was medical. For William, air was survival, and so geography became governance. His illness was no secret to those around him. Courtiers remarked on the sound of his breathing behind closed doors. Ambassadors noted his reliance on rest and warmth. At times, he appeared at court bundled in cloaks, even in mild weather, as if his lungs were always one chill away from betrayal. He slept often in heated rooms, with windows sealed and attendants ready in case of a nighttime attack. And yet, despite this, he was relentless. He led military campaigns across Europe, notably against Louis XIV's France. He rode with his troops, negotiated with allies, dictated policy, and micromanaged details of war. His body was a limitation, but never an excuse. When a soldier coughed, he offered advice. When generals hesitated, he pushed forward. He fought not just enemies, but his own biology. And for most of his life, he won. But age and accident conspired against him. In 1702, at the age of 51, William's already vulnerable frame took a catastrophic hit literally. While riding in the grounds of Hampton Court, his horse stumbled on a molehill. He fell awkwardly and fractured his collarbone. On its own, this might have been survivable. But for a man with a chronic lung condition, the shock to the system triggered a rapid decline. His chest weakened, breathing grew harder, coughing fits intensified, pneumonia set in. He lingered for weeks, refusing to fully retreat from governance, even as he struggled to speak above a whisper. Doctors tried poultices, purges, and hot coals near the feet standard fare for the era, none of which did more than delay the inevitable. He died in March 1702, exhausted, hollowed, and still, in the minds of many, a foreigner. Even in death, William remained a paradox. He had been invited by Parliament, yet never fully embraced by the English public. He had ruled England, Scotland, and Ireland, yet preferred the Netherlands to the end. He was a Protestant hero who rarely smiled in public, and a king of 3 kingdoms who never truly felt at home in any of them. But, perhaps most poignantly, he was a man who restructured a monarchy while rarely drawing a full breath. And that breathlessness didn't end with him, because the House of Hanover was coming. But before it arrived, there were two more kings to pass through the quiet fading of George I and the slow dimming of George II. The first began with a stroke and ended in silence. On a road far from home, George I, Great Britain divided by Ireland, R 1714-1727. George, I was never supposed to be an English king, not in temperament, not in language, and certainly not in geography. Born and raised in the electorate of Hanover, he was a German prince through and through, stiff, orderly, efficient, and only vaguely interested in the idea of Britishness. He spoke little English, showed little flair, and governed a country whose customs seemed to confuse him as much as his health began to betray him. Yet there he was, crowned in 1714, plucked from the relative obscurity of the German minor royalty by the Act of Settlement, a document that had declared, in no uncertain terms, that the English crown could only pass to a Protestant, and George, 21st in line by blood but first by religion, fit the bill. It didn't matter that he was distant, uninspiring, or barely intelligible to his own parliament. His job was not to shine. His job was to exist in the right church. But behind the image of the reserved, foreign monarch, behind the elaborate wigs and ceremonial carriage rides, George I was slowly slipping into physical decline, and unlike some monarchs whose illnesses were private, intermittent, or politicized into silence, George's decline became something else entirely, a long, quiet tapering of vitality, culminating in a sudden and fatal collapse on the road to where he always felt most at home back in Hanover. By the early 1720s, the king's health was no longer robust. He suffered from what was then broadly called dropsy, a term used for various forms of edema, often linked to heart or kidney failure. His face swelled, his movements slowed, his appetite faded. Court physicians noted fatigue, breathlessness, and an increasingly visible tremor in his hands. He didn't speak of it. George was not a man of disclosure. In fact, he was hardly a man of words at all when it came to his English court. He preferred German. He preferred Hanover. He preferred, in general, not to be observed too closely. And yet, he remained functional. Functional enough to rule, to ride, to endure the ceremonies of governance. But behind the scenes, he was withdrawing more and more into routine and ritual, letting ministers handle the increasingly complex machinery of British government. Robert Walpole, the man now often called the first Prime Minister, flourished in this environment. George was the monarch, but not the manager. He was there, but increasingly not present. Then came the journey. In June 1727, George I left England for his regular summer trip to Hanover. It was a standard ritual, one that brought him comfort, familiarity, and the illusion of vitality. But his body was already failing. During the crossing and travel overland, he began to complain of pressure in the head, headaches, nausea, numbness. Classic signs, though, then unrecognized of cerebrovascular trouble. In the early hours of the 11th of June, at the Bishop's Palace in Osnabrück, George suffered what would now be classified as a massive stroke. He collapsed in bed, unconscious. He never recovered. He died the next morning, far from London, far from Westminster, and far from a public that had never quite accepted him. The king who barely spoke their language, who barely engaged with their politics, who had ruled them without ever truly knowing them, was gone. But George's quiet death revealed something even more uncomfortable than his distant life, that monarchs can disappear long before they die. The body breaks down slowly. The presence thins. The decisions get handed off, and by the time the crown passes on, the real transfer of power has already happened, unspoken, unrecorded, unnoticed. George, I didn't go out with a declaration or a battle cry. He went out the way he ruled, silently. But his son, George II, would be forced to rule with one hand already slipping from the grip of sound and light. The ears went first, then the eyes. And all the while, the throne had to pretend nothing was lost. George II, Great Britain divided by Ireland, are 1727-1760. If George I ruled England without ever quite joining it, George II ruled by acting like he'd always belonged while slowly losing his grip on the very senses that tethered him to the world. Born in Hanover, much like his father, George II inherited the throne in 1727 with all the ambivalence of a man receiving a complicated gift. He was more visibly engaged than George I, more publicly active, and more emotionally volatile. He attended cabinet meetings, reviewed troops, bickered with ministers, and even fought in battle, famously becoming the last British monarch to personally lead troops into combat at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. But behind the image of a sharp-tempered, militarily inclined king was something harder to detect at first, a slow sensory unraveling that would define the later years of his long reign. The first thing to go was his hearing. By the 1,740 seconds, George II was already struggling to follow court discussions without repetition. Ambassadors noted his tendency to misinterpret questions, offer inappropriate responses, or become irritable when forced to strain to catch a conversation. Ministers began to adapt, speaking louder, enunciating more clearly, crafting written briefings rather than relying on spoken summaries. His court, like any good royal apparatus, adapted in silence, but the strain showed. George became increasingly impatient in meetings. He would interrupt, wave people off, or give curt answers without hearing the full report. At court receptions, he smiled stiffly, nodded automatically, and avoided lengthy interactions. It was not indifference, it was isolation, made necessary by a world that was quite literally growing quieter. Then came the eyesight. In his later years, George began experiencing visible difficulty reading documents and recognizing faces at a distance. There are scattered accounts of him squinting at speeches, asking for candlelight even in daylight hours, and avoiding eye contact in conversations where he previously would have stared down ministers with sharp Hanoverian precision. And yet, he never publicly acknowledged any of it. No monarch did not in that era. Decline was private. Infirmity was concealed. Kings didn't wear glasses, didn't use ear trumpets, and certainly didn't admit that the world was blurring around them. To admit bodily decline was to invite political decay. So George pretended, and the court followed suit. His decisions remained generally sound, though increasingly shaped and filtered by ministers like William Pitt the Elder, whose rhetorical clarity and political deftness became essential. George still appeared at ceremonies, still reviewed the guards, still attended church with punctual reverence. But by the 1,750 seconds, much of the nation had begun to treat him like a constitutional placeholder, a grandfathered king, stately but receding. He died suddenly in 1760, aged 76, from what modern historians believe was an aortic aneurysm. It was a sharp, final end to a reign that had slowly dimmed, one sense at a time. And with George II, a subtle line was crossed. He was the last British king born outside the British Isles, the last monarch buried in Westminster Abbey, and, in some sense, the last king to decline in private, surrounded by the quiet indulgence of a court too polite to say, "He can't hear you anymore." But the next king wouldn't be granted that silence. He heard things too much, saw things that weren't there, felt the world pulling apart at the seams inside his mind. George III, the king whose illness became legend, and whose legacy was devoured by the question no monarch wants to face. What if the crown sits on a mind that no longer knows it's there? George III, Great Britain divided by Ireland, R. 1760-1820. George III began his reign with clarity, clear purpose, clear ideals, and most significantly, a clear mind. He was meticulous, well-read, and serious in ways his predecessors rarely were. Unlike his Hanoverian forebears, he was born in Britain, spoke English fluently, and actually seemed to care about governing. He had an astonishing memory, an appetite for science, and a reputation for personal morality. He didn't gamble, he didn't keep mistresses. He was faithful to his wife, an unthinkable achievement for a king at the time. In short, George III appeared to be exactly what the British monarchy needed in an age of growing public scrutiny. And then his mind turned against him. But not all at once. The tragedy of George III was not that he went mad, it was that he knew he was losing himself and couldn't stop it. For decades, historians believed he suffered from a rare metabolic disorder called porphyria, triggered, perhaps, by stress, medication, or even diet. The symptoms seemed to match: severe abdominal pain, muscle weakness, bouts of confusion, and the infamous periods of mental instability. But more recent studies, especially those examining his correspondence, suggest something different and in many ways more human: bipolar disorder, possibly with episodes of psychosis. Whatever the true diagnosis, what remains clear is the pattern. It came in cycles. George's first major breakdown happened in 1788. He was 50 years old, well into a reign that had already seen the loss of the American colonies, the turbulence of parliamentary reform, and the growing threat of revolution in France. In the midst of political and familial strain, the king began behaving erratically. His speech became pressured and rapid. He wrote letters at all hours, often several in the same day, filled with disconnected thoughts and leaps in logic. He refused to rest. He talked endlessly. And then, without warning, collapsed into periods of deep withdrawal. He couldn't recognize people. He couldn't sleep. He fixated on religious ideas and wept uncontrollably. He babbled. At times, he had to be physically restrained. His household went into quiet panic. His doctors debated treatments with a kind of grim 18th century confidence that left bruises rather than answers. Parliament, meanwhile, was paralyzed. A regency bill was prepared, one that would place power in the hands of his eldest son, the dissolute and famously extravagant Prince of Wales. But before it could be enacted, George recovered. Abruptly, he returned to governance as though nothing had happened, insisting on his full capacity. The regency was shelved, the court resumed its ceremonies, and Britain, uncomfortably, carried on. But the episodes continued, intermittent at first, then more frequent, always terrifying. The worst of them came in the early 19th century, after the death of his beloved daughter, Princess Amelia, in 1810. That loss quietly unbearable, for a king who prized duty above all seemed to rupture something in him that never healed. From that point forward, George slipped rapidly into permanent cognitive decline. He was removed from public view. The regency was enacted at last, with the Prince of Wales governing as Prince Regent. George III lived out his final decade mostly in Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and, by all accounts, locked in a world entirely of his own making. He talked to people who weren't there. He played the harpsichord for hours. He believed he was in conversation with dead ancestors. He signed documents with nonsense or simply drew lines. The once diligent king, the man who read every letter, who annotated legislation in the margins, who memorized the names of obscure colonial governors, was gone. But he never stopped being king. Officially, the title remained his until his death in 1820. He was king in name, in law, and in portrait long after he'd ceased to understand what any of it meant. And that was perhaps the most unsettling part. Because, unlike his predecessors, George III didn't lose control of his limbs or his senses. He lost control of himself. He couldn't explain what was wrong, he couldn't fight it, and he couldn't retire. Monarchs weren't allowed to step down, not in 18th century Britain, so he reigned in silence, while others governed in his place. His body outlived his mind by more than a decade. And when the news of his death finally came, it was met not with shock or mourning, but with relief. Relief that the long, invisible reign of an absent king had finally ended. But the throne didn't fall into peace. It fell into excess. Because the next man, Was George's son already ruling as regent, already unpopular, already trapped in a body that, like his father's, could not bear the weight of a crown? George IV, United Kingdom, R. 1820–1830. George IV was one of those rare monarchs whose body became a metaphor before the historians ever got involved. Overweight, overindulgent, overdressed, over it. If George III was remembered for his piety and mental deterioration, George IV would be remembered for indulgence in all things: clothes, food, drink, architecture, flattery, gossip, grief, and gout, especially gout. He began as a fashionable prince, the sort who made scandal feel like an art form. He surrounded himself with poets and painters, posed for portraits in military uniforms he rarely wore outside the studio, and transformed Brighton into a seaside fantasy land, with his beloved royal pavilion, a building that looked like a piece of colonial satire built out of sugar. But the older he grew, the more his health unraveled, until eventually George was less a man than a collection of medical contradictions sewn into brocade. Gout was the most obvious affliction. It plagued him for decades, swelling his joints and leaving him periodically immobile. Court physicians recorded episodes in which the king could barely walk, relying on attendants to move between chambers. One observer noted that by the late 1820s, George would wince even when shifting in his chair, his face trying and failing to remain composed. Gout is inflammatory. It thrives on diet, weight, and lifestyle, all of which George spectacularly mismanaged. He consumed with enthusiasm and little restraint. Dinners went on for hours. He once reportedly consumed 7 courses in a single sitting while wearing a velvet robe lined with ermine, and the indulgence wasn't limited to food. He was also chronically dependent on alcohol and opium-based medications administered regularly to soothe pain and help him sleep. The result was a king often glazed in appearance, bloated in figure, and unpredictable in mood. And yet, he ruled. He ruled during a time of enormous political transformation. The Napoleonic Wars ended, the Congress of Vienna redrew Europe, the Industrial Revolution reshaped the kingdom. George, despite or perhaps because of his physical limitations, receded from the center of these developments. He preferred privacy, ritual, and deference. Cabinets met without him. Policies were often made in his name, but not by his hand. His public appearances became increasingly rare. When he did emerge, it was with great effort and even greater pomp, draped in diamonds, carried in modified carriages, hiding the pain beneath several layers of ceremonial fabric. But the truth couldn't be buried forever. By the end of his reign, George was physically exhausted. His legs swelled, his breath grew short. He suffered from heart problems, advanced arteriosclerosis, and bladder issues. Reports describe him spending hours in bed, unable to sleep, complaining of heat and pressure, calling for attendants in the night just to help him sit upright. He died in 1830, bloated and ravaged by years of systemic strain, but he left behind more than just debt and decoration. He left a monarchy on the brink of modern reform, a public increasingly skeptical of royal decadence, and a model of kingship that could no longer rely on display alone. George IV's body had, in the end, become a symbol of something larger, how physical decline reveals the limits of inherited power. And the man who followed him, his brother, William IV, would learn those limits intimately. Because William didn't rule through grandeur. He ruled through discomfort and chronic illness, and a growing sense that the age of unchallenged kingship was slowly slipping away. William IV, United Kingdom, R. 1830–1837. If George IV was the over-decorated relic of an overstretched monarchy, William IV was the plain wooden chair that followed the gilded throne. He came to the crown late at 64 years old, after having spent most of his life on the fringes of royal relevance. Known more as Sailor Billy than future monarch, he had served in the Royal Navy, lived modestly with his mistress for decades, and seemed, to many, more like an eccentric uncle than a future head of state. No one expected much, but no one quite expected this. A king who would preside over the first great parliamentary reform in centuries, while battling a slow, unglamorous erosion of his physical health. William's illnesses didn't make headlines, at least not in the way his brother's gout and girth had. His body broke down in subtler, steadier ways through fatigue, swelling, and respiratory difficulty that lingered in the background of his reign like an unwanted courtier. There was no singular dramatic collapse, no medical mystery, just a man who woke up each day a little more tired than the last. He had inherited a system under pressure. The public was increasingly restless. The Whigs were mobilizing reform, and the memory of George IV's indulgence still stung. William, perhaps because of his distance from power for so long, understood the moment better than most expected. He wasn't a visionary, but he knew when not to stand in the way. He let the 1832 Reform Act pass, breaking the grip of rotten boroughs and extending the vote modestly but significantly. It was the kind of political development that might have consumed a younger, more ambitious monarch. William let it happen. But his own body wouldn't grant him the same courtesy. By 1833, reports began surfacing that the king's energy was flagging. He canceled appearances, delegated more often. Visitors noted that his complexion looked troubled, his speech labored, his movements stiff. The causes were never publicly specified, but later accounts point toward chronic edema, what was then called dropsy, likely related to congestive heart failure. Fluid built up in his limbs, particularly his legs. His breathing became heavier, especially at night. He slept fitfully, sitting upright in bed to avoid the pressure on his lungs. There were periods of denial. He would still insist on reviewing troops or taking short walks, but each outing came with consequence. He would return exhausted, his legs visibly swollen, and his energy depleted for days. Attendants learned to keep chairs nearby. Ministers scheduled brief audiences, knowing they couldn't count on more than half an hour before the king began blinking more often, rubbing his chest, or excusing himself with a cough that wouldn't stop. Unlike his predecessors, William didn't seem eager to mask his decline. He spoke frankly about death, often joking about his own mortality with a sailor's bluntness. "I've done my bit," he reportedly told one courtier, "and I'm ready to turn in." It wasn't fatalism, it was realism. He had no illusions of divine mandate. He knew he was a transitional figure, a man whose real contribution was to not make things worse. Still, he carried on. He hosted ministers, signed legislation, corresponded with foreign dignitaries, but by the spring of 1837, his health had deteriorated enough that whispers of succession began to circulate more loudly. The crown would pass to his niece, and one 8-year-old girl named Victoria. A new age was waiting in the wings. On the 20th of June, 1837, William died in Windsor Castle. He had ruled for just 7 years. There was no national trauma, no crisis, just a quiet closing of a modest chapter. But William's body tells a story often overlooked in royal narratives, the story of quiet decline, of unceremonious aging, of a king who didn't collapse, but simply faded, week by week, into stillness. His reign marked the beginning of something new, not because of what he did, but because of how he made space for what came next. And what came next would be industrial, imperial, constitutional. But the frailty didn't end with William, because the next monarch, his son, George V, would live in an entirely different world, one shaped by modern war, mass media, and an empire stretched to breaking. And in that world, kings couldn't hide illness behind chamber doors. They had to breathe, and walk, and wave, while coughing through a lung that no longer opened. George V, United Kingdom, R. 1910-1936. George V was never meant to be a symbol of endurance. He wasn't poetic, charismatic, or especially imaginative. He wore uniforms that fit well and expressions that didn't change. He hunted, smoked, shot game, and signed papers. He didn't write love letters or epigrams. He simply endured. And then he kept enduring. He came to the throne in 1910, a second son who only became heir after the death of his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, a royal golden child snuffed out by influenza. George was not golden. He was practical, unshowy, the monarchy's answer to the 20th century's new demands: stability, reliability, and restraint. A king who would outlive multiple revolutions by standing still. But the one thing he couldn't outlast was his own breath. George V was a lifelong smoker, not casually, habitually. Pipes, cigarettes, cigarillos, the kind of constant intake that made ash part of his daily wardrobe. And while no one blinked in that era, least of all the doctors, his body recorded every puff in soft, silent injury. By the late 1920 seconds, the effects began to show. A persistent cough, decreased stamina, occasional breathlessness during royal engagements. His physicians diagnosed it simply as bronchitis, a term that covered a wide spectrum of respiratory conditions, from mild irritation to the slow corrosion of the lungs. In George's case, it was the latter. The smoking had done its work. His bronchitis became chronic. His breath shortened. Simple speeches became exertions. Carriage rides were redesigned to allow for easier rest. By 1930, his coughing fits became frequent enough that aides carried lozenges and handkerchiefs at all times. The public never saw these details, but the inner court lived with them. Then came oxygen. By 1935, George V was using supplemental oxygen behind closed doors, not just during episodes, but as a regular part of his day. His lungs were failing. The official bulletins remained vague. Recurring illness, fatigue, influenza. But inside the palace, the machines were humming. He began appearing less. Photographs were tightly controlled. His once brisk speech slowed. He spent long hours in bed. Ministers visited him privately rather than in council chambers. He was present, but increasingly spectral. The king had become a patient. And still, the work continued. He signed documents, he oversaw correspondence, he delivered brief statements. His final major act was to celebrate his Silver Jubilee in 1935, a moment of national unity, empire-wide affection, and carefully managed illusion. The crowds cheered, the flags waved. The cameras rolled, and behind the scenes, George coughed into a linen handkerchief, nodded, and turned away. He died in January 1936. The official announcement was dignified, but the real end, as later revealed, was clinically managed. His physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, administered a fatal dose of morphine and cocaine to ensure a dignified death and meet newspaper deadlines. Even the king's final breath was curated. But his illness left behind a deeper question. What happens when the monarchy becomes a living museum piece propped up, oxygenated, smiled through? Because the man who followed him, George VI, would know that tension intimately. He couldn't breathe easily either, but his struggle wasn't hidden in machines. It was heard in every sentence. Caught between war and wireless radio, the next king would have to speak clearly while battling a voice that didn't always come when called. George VI, United Kingdom, are 1936-1952. Some kings are born with a crown already hovering over their heads. Others wear it because no one else could or would. George VI belonged to the latter category. He never wanted the throne. He never prepared for it. And when it landed on him, it brought with it the one thing he feared most, the obligation to speak. Because George VI had a stammer, and in the age of the radio, that meant he had a disability that everyone could hear. Born Albert Frederick Arthur George in 1895, the second son of George V, he was known simply as Bertie to family and friends. Unlike his older brother, Edward, charming, glamorous, unpredictable, Bertie was quiet, dutiful, reserved. He served in the Royal Navy, saw combat in World War I, and carried out public duties with a visible sense of discomfort, polite discomfort, royal discomfort. The kind that never quite breaks into panic, but is always a half-second away from apology. But the stammer was more than just social awkwardness. It was relentless. From early childhood, he struggled with speech, particularly with words beginning with hard consonants. Formal occasions were a nightmare. Reading aloud in school left him humiliated. His tutors were frustrated. His father, George V, was stern and unsympathetic. Bertie was told to try harder, stand straighter, be braver. And so, like many children with unrecognized speech disorders, he built up an arsenal of coping strategies, avoiding certain words, using filler phrases, tensing his body before speaking. It didn't fix the problem. It only trained him to hide it. When his brother Edward abdicated in 1936 to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson, the monarchy found itself in a crisis not just of succession, but of symbolism. Edward had been the charismatic face of modern monarchy. Bertie, now George VI, was the reluctant substitute with a voice that betrayed him every time he opened his mouth. But what happened next was one of the quietest transformations in royal history. He didn't cure his stammer. He managed it. Through persistence, practice, and an unlikely partnership with an Australian speech therapist named Lionel Logue, George VI learned to face the microphone. Logue wasn't a traditional doctor. He used rhythm, breath control, and emotional coaching. He didn't just train the king's voice, he rebuilt his confidence. The turning point came during the Second World War. Britain needed a symbol of unity, calm, and endurance. George VI became that symbol not because he was smooth or eloquent, but because he wasn't. When he gave speeches, he spoke slowly, deliberately, pausing often. Each word felt earned. Each sentence carried a weight of effort that made his sincerity palpable. Behind the scenes, the strain never went away. The king worked tirelessly on speeches, often rehearsing for hours. He still dreaded public addresses. His health, already fragile, worsened under wartime pressure. He developed chronic ulcers, suffered from fatigue, and continued to chain smoke ironically, a habit he picked up in the hopes it would relax his throat muscles. By the late 1940 seconds, that smoking caught up with him. He developed lung cancer, though the word was never spoken publicly. His doctors removed part of his lung in a secretive operation in 1951, but the decline was obvious. He appeared gaunt, his energy flagged, his voice, once a symbol of perseverance, began to weaken again. He died in 1952, at the age of 56, a quiet death in his sleep at Sandringham. But the memory of George VI lives on, not because he was a strong king in the traditional sense, but because he ruled through his weakness. His stammer didn't disappear. It wasn't overcome. It became part of his monarchy. The pauses, the hesitations, the silence between the words, they all made him human in a role that too often demands perfection. And for all the ceremony that surrounds kingship, there's something quietly revolutionary about a monarch who taught a nation how to listen to someone who couldn't always speak. But if George VI struggled with voice, the next ruler struggled with movement itself. Robert III of Scotland couldn't hide behind microphones or ministries. He was quite literally brought low. His throne may have stood tall, but he couldn't stand beside it. Robert III, Scotland, R. 1390-1406. It's rare for a king to openly acknowledge that his body has failed him. Rarer still for that failure to be so visible, so consequential, and so permanent that it reshapes the governance of an entire kingdom. But that's precisely what happened with Robert III of Scotland, a king who, by the time he wore the crown, could no longer walk without assistance. Born John Stuart around 1337, he was the eldest son of Robert II of Scotland, and by most accounts, a noble and competent knight in his early years. He fought in skirmishes, held court positions, and seemed on track to inherit the throne without controversy. But something happened. An accident, perhaps an equestrian one, sometime in his 30s or early 40s, that changed everything. The details are sketchy, as medieval injuries often are. Some sources say he was kicked by a horse. Others suggest he fell and was trampled. Whatever the case, the injury left him physically impaired, possibly with partial paralysis or severe damage to his legs. From that point onward, he struggled to walk unaided and required assistance for public appearances. This wasn't just a personal injury, it was a political liability. In a kingdom where authority was often measured by martial strength and visibility on the battlefield, a king who couldn't mount a horse was a king under scrutiny. Robert, perhaps in an attempt to reframe the narrative, changed his regnal name from John to Robert, hoping to distance himself from the disastrous reign of John Balliol, whose name still echoed with memories of weakness and humiliation under English control. But renaming couldn't change his body. His reign was, in effect, governed by others. His younger brother, Robert, Duke of Albany, took control of much of the political machinery. Robert III, sidelined by disability, was reduced to a ceremonial role. He issued charters, he made appearances, but he was no longer the center of power. His physical vulnerability had become a constitutional fact. What makes Robert's story all the more tragic is his awareness of this displacement. He knew he was being sidelined. He knew his reign was being managed around him, and yet he never formally abdicated. He never fled or disappeared. He simply stayed silent, seated, present in name but not in action. The ultimate blow came with the death of his eldest son, David, Duke of Rothesay, in 1402. David had been the heir apparent, the young, energetic counterbalance to his father's frailty. But after being arrested by the Duke of Albany and imprisoned at Falkland Palace, David died under suspicious circumstances. The official cause was illness, but the political overtones were deafening. Robert was devastated, powerless to punish, unable to even travel to his son's tomb unaided. He reportedly declared himself not king, but the worst of all men. He then sent his younger son, James, just a boy at the time, away by ship, hoping to preserve the lineage. The ship was intercepted by English forces. James was captured and held prisoner in England for nearly 2 decades. Robert died in 1406, alone, broken, and effectively unkinged by life. His body had betrayed him. His court had ignored him. His son had been taken. And Scotland was left leaderless in all but name. He remains a rare example of a king who reigned in the shadow of immobility, and whose reign demonstrates how fragile the illusion of kingship becomes when the body can no longer perform it. But if Robert's difference lay in how he moved, the next monarch's uniqueness was written plainly on his skin. A birthmark bright enough to earn a nickname. Not deformity, not disease, just color. But in medieval politics, even pigment could be destiny. James II of Scotland R. 1437–1460. Some kings are remembered for the wars they fought, others for the laws they passed. James II of Scotland is remembered, at least in part, for something far stranger, a mark on his face. Not a metaphorical one, a real, visible stain that bloomed across his skin, a deep red patch, possibly stretching from cheek to jawline, depending on which chronicler you believe. A congenital port wine stain, medically benign, politically complicated, the kind of thing that wouldn't matter in a private citizen. But on a monarch's face, in the 15th century, it was as good as prophecy. They called him Fiery Face. Born in 1430 and crowned king at just 6 years old, James inherited a fragile throne. His father, James I, had been assassinated in a murky plot involving disgruntled nobles. The boy king was installed under the usual pretense of ceremonial continuity, but everyone knew the truth. Scotland was being run by factions, each using the child as a pawn in a much larger game. For years, James lived in the long shadow of these power brokers, his public appearances carefully controlled, his authority delayed. And always, there was the mark. Medieval superstition treated bodily blemishes as moral signs. A visible difference was rarely just biological, it was symbolic. God was sending a message, the logic went, and the king's face was the parchment. Some believed the red stain on James's cheek signaled divine anger. Others saw it as a mark of future violence, a foreshadowing of rage. The nickname Fiery Face was not affectionate. It was both description and prediction. But James refused to be defined by it. He grew into adolescence with a rare defiance, sharp, energetic, and increasingly intolerant of his noble minders. By his teens, he had begun to push back against the Regency Council. By his 20s, he was done being managed. And then, in 1452, came the turning point. The Black Douglases, one of Scotland's most powerful noble families, had grown dangerously independent. James invited the 8th Earl of Douglas to Stirling Castle under the promise of safe conduct. What followed remains one of the most shocking episodes in Scottish royal history. The king, in a sudden act of violence, personally stabbed the Earl during a confrontation. His retainers finished the job. The act was justified under royal prerogative. The message was clear. The boy king was gone. The man was in charge. In the aftermath, James launched a campaign against the Douglases, stripping them of their lands and titles, and breaking their stranglehold on the nobility. It was a ruthless assertion of royal power, and a successful one. He re-established the monarchy as an independent force in Scottish politics, no longer just a ceremonial head, but a genuine actor. And through it all, the mark remained. There's no evidence James tried to hide it. No portraits survive that show him clearly. Scottish royal art of the time was more symbolic than representational. But chronicles describe it plainly. He didn't wear masks. He didn't obscure his face with ornate beards or high collars. In some sense, he made it part of the office. The king's face was unusual, and everyone knew it. And still, he ruled. But not for long. In 1460, while besieging Roxburgh Castle, a strategically vital English outpost on Scottish soil, James ordered the use of a massive cannon, one of the early examples of royal artillery in Britain. He stood close during its firing, proud of this symbol of modern royal power. And then, without warning, the cannon exploded. James was killed instantly. The story is almost too poetic to be true. The king with a fiery face, killed by fire. The symbol that had followed him from birth fulfilled in a flash of smoke and iron. The child marked for violence, undone not by court politics or rebellion, but by a machine of war he had embraced too closely. His son, James III, was just 9 years old, another child king, another dangerous minority, and another throne passed forward on the unstable legs of symbolism. But if James II was marked at birth, the next man in our procession of frailty was marked by something else entirely: time. Because Malcolm IV, the Maiden, didn't have a stain or a scar. He had the kind of body that simply didn't last. Malcolm IV, the Maiden, Scotland, R. 1153-1165. The throne isn't always heavy because of what you carry. Sometimes it's heavy because of what you lack. Malcolm IV of Scotland came to the crown as a boy, ruled as a teenager, and died as a young man who had barely outgrown his ceremonial robes. His reign lasted 12 years, but his body never quite caught up. Known to history as Malcolm the Maiden, he remains one of Britain's quietest kings, a figure defined not by war or rebellion, but by slow, persistent physical weakness. Born in 1141, Malcolm was the eldest son of Henry of Scotland and the grandson of King David I, one of the most reform-minded and politically savvy kings of the medieval North. David had spent his reign importing Norman ideas, building royal authority, and raising expectations for what the Scottish crown could be. And then came Malcolm, quiet, sickly, and 15 years old. He was crowned at Scone in 1153, the traditional site for Scottish kingship, but the ceremony must have felt like a placeholder. The young king was described by chroniclers as pale, slender and delicate in health. He never married, never had children, and rarely led troops in person. His nickname, the Maiden, was first used as a compliment praising his piety and restraint, but eventually turned into a commentary on his physical state, a king who seemed too fragile for the throne he had inherited. But Malcolm was not entirely absent. He ruled during a period of political complexity, with Scotland still entangled in territorial claims over northern England. He performed acts of homage to Henry II, King of England, ceding control over disputed lands to maintain peace. It was a pragmatic move, unpopular but shrewd, and yet it wasn't seen as strength. It was seen as capitulation. In the eyes of his critics, Malcolm's gentleness, his health, his very posture, reflected a monarchy bending too easily to outside pressure. His body became part of the politics. When he failed to appear at a battle in Galloway, rumors spread that he was too ill to travel. When he refused marriage alliances, whispers suggested sterility or weakness. When he limited his public appearances, nobles began to speak openly about succession. The exact nature of Malcolm's illness remains unknown. Some speculate tuberculosis, a slow, wasting disease common in the medieval period. Others suggest a form of anemia or a congenital disorder that stunted his development. What we do know is that he never looked the part. He was smaller than expected, weaker, less commanding. His younger brother William, later William the Lion, stood in contrast, bold, martial, visible. By his early 20s, Malcolm's health had clearly deteriorated. He withdrew from court life, his speeches grew shorter, his letters became less frequent. He appointed his brother to more and more of the state's ceremonial roles, and in 1165, at the age of just 24, Malcolm IV died. No scandal, no rebellion, just the end of a reign that had never quite begun. And so, the throne passed to his brother, a king more in the traditional mold, loud, forceful, visible. But Malcolm remains a strange punctuation mark in Scottish history, a king too gentle to be feared, too frail to be hated, too short-lived to be legendary, but not forgotten. Because in this long line of monarchs whose bodies refuse to cooperate, Malcolm's legacy is a reminder that sometimes the most destabilizing difference is not a wound or a mark, but a slow fade from strength. And the next king would learn that lesson late in life, ruling well, then suddenly, cruelly, losing the power to stand at all. Llywelyn ab Iorwerth, the Great, until a stroke made him still. Llywelyn ab Iorwerth, the Great, Prince of Gwynedd and much of Wales, d. 1240. In the mountains of Gwynedd, where the wind cuts like strategy and the valleys guard their secrets, there once ruled a man known as Llywelyn the Great, though history rarely grants such titles without irony. He was the architect of medieval Wales's last great consolidation, a warrior prince turned statesman, a builder of castles and treaties. The only Welsh ruler of his age who could stare down English kings as something close to an equal. But Llywelyn's story didn't end on the battlefield. It ended, as so many royal lives did, with the slow, unceremonious betrayal of his body, not by blade or betrayal, but by stroke. A sovereign silenced mid-sentence. Born around 1173, Llywelyn was a grandson of Owain Gwynedd, the towering patriarch of North Wales whose descendants spent decades warring over scraps of inheritance. Llywelyn came of age in this chaos, and like so many other unimportant younger sons, he carved his own importance through war. By 1200, he had outmaneuvered his rivals and asserted dominance over much of Gwynedd. Over the next 2 decades, he expanded further, marrying John of England's illegitimate daughter, negotiating shrewdly with the Plantagenet crown, and, by the 1232, styling himself not merely as Prince of Gwynedd, but Prince of all Wales. He wasn't wrong. Llywelyn was the first Welsh ruler to establish something resembling centralized authority over the fractured cantrefs and mountain strongholds. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a strategist, a legal reformer, a diplomat with Latin clerks and ambitions that stretched far beyond the Menai Strait. But by the late 1232, that all began to change. Contemporary records note that Llywelyn began to disappear from court functions. His movement slowed, his speech became irregular. By 1237, chroniclers quietly acknowledged what the court could no longer deny. The prince had suffered a paralytic stroke. Whether it came suddenly or in stages is unclear, but the effects were permanent. Llywelyn lost the ability to rule directly. Sources describe him as partially incapacitated, no longer able to walk unaided and possibly limited in his ability to speak or command. This was no brief illness to be overcome with herbs and rest. It was a structural collapse in the body of a man who had once ridden through mountain passes at the head of armies. The stroke did not kill him, but it removed him from the game. Power began to shift to his son and designated heir, Dyfed ap Llywelyn. The transition was managed with the usual mixture of ceremony and anxiety. For a polity held together largely by the force of Llywelyn's charisma and military will, his silence posed a constitutional problem. The principality wasn't designed to run on protocol, it ran on presence. And Llywelyn's presence, once unmistakable, now came only in carefully managed appearances, seated, stoic, remote. He died in 1240 at Aberconwy Abbey, where he had retired in those final years to spend his time in prayer, planning, and stillness. The prince who had once challenged King John and reshaped the political geography of his country left the world as a monk might, quiet, unseen, and half forgotten by the noise of the generation already rising to replace him. But his death left something behind. A vacuum, yes, but also a precedent, a model of what Welsh unity could look like. His paralysis may have ended his rule, but it did not undo it. He had shown that a native Welsh ruler could wield the tools of legitimacy, diplomacy, law, alliance, language. He had shown that a man born in the shadow of inheritance could cast his own. And yet, his story is still often told with a sad final footnote, that he didn't die in triumph, or war, or fire. He simply stopped. The body held together as long as it could, and then it didn't. But if Llywelyn's story is one of ambition slowed by the brain, the next, our final tale, is about how kingship could be undone not by age or illness, but by a single, literal blemish. Because in ancient Ireland, kings had to be perfect. And if they weren't, they had to abdicate. Congal Cake and Cormac Mac Airt, early Irish high kings, legendary period. There are few political systems in history, quite like early Ireland's. Its laws, Brehon laws, were equal parts poetic, brutal, and oddly fixated on symmetry. Under these laws, a king had to be physically unblemished, not just in virtue or speech or bloodline, but in body. A cut could be concealed, a limp might be forgiven, but a true, permanent deformity, that was disqualification. And so we arrive at the two most famous cases of blemish-born abdication, Congal Caiich and Cormac Mac Airt. Kings undone not by enemies, but by appearances. Let's begin with Congal Cake, king of Ulaid, a northern kingdom and, for a brief, disputed time, High King of Ireland. His story is legendary, poetic, and ever so slightly absurd. At a feast, Congal is stung in the eye by a bee. Yes, a bee. The sting causes him to lose sight in one eye, rendering him literally half blind. In most societies, this would make him unlucky, perhaps even sympathetic. In ancient Ireland, it made him unfit to rule. According to tradition, Congal was forced to abdicate the high kingship of Tara, the ceremonial seat of Irish sovereignty, because his vision loss violated the legal requirement that a king be whole, unblemished in face and form. But Congal didn't take his demotion lightly. He spent years gathering support, forming alliances, and eventually leading a coalition army, including mercenaries from Scotland, against the reigning High King at the Battle of Mag Rath. The result was a disaster. Congal was defeated and killed, all because of a bee, all because of a law that couldn't separate kingship from cosmetic integrity. And then there's Cormac mac Airt. Cormac's story is older, more mythical, but perhaps even more tragic. He was one of Ireland's most celebrated kings, wise, learned, a just lawgiver. Under his reign, the kingdom of Tara flourished. He introduced new legal codes, reformed the bardic tradition, and presided over a golden age of storytelling and political structure. And then, as the legends tell it, he lost an eye. The reason varies. In some versions, it's lost in battle. In others, it's a divine punishment. But the result is always the same. Cormac, now visibly blemished, could no longer rule from Tara. He did not resist. He simply stepped down, moving to a lesser court, where he lived out his days as a philosopher king, writing, advising, and waiting for the end. His wisdom was not questioned. His laws remained in force, but he was no longer king, because the law said he couldn't be. Together, Congal and Cormac reveal something deeply unsettling about kingship, not just in Ireland, but everywhere, that the crown often has less to do with capacity than appearance. That physical perfection was once considered synonymous with moral authority. That the body visible, examined, politicized could make or unmake a ruler faster than any army ever could. And so we end where we began, not with glory or conquest, but with contradiction. Kings who couldn't walk, kings who couldn't breathe, kings who couldn't speak, kings whose bodies did not match their myths. And still, they ruled, some briefly, some boldly, some barely, until the body said otherwise.